Mike Rea, it is such a privilege to be able to spend some time together. I've been a fan of your writing and of your cartooning on LinkedIn. Just really love your spirit and have been excited about our time together. So thanks for your generosity of your time and your experience here for this conversation.
No, Jeff, thank you so much. I already know from our brief chat that this is going to be fun and interesting, and thank you for bringing your curiosity to the conversation.
Oh, you're most welcome. So the name of our series is Conversations That Leaders Aren't Having. And the question I ask all my guests is, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear that phrase, conversations leaders aren't having?
They may be having it, but I think they often ignore it. And I think there's one thing that I find about leadership versus managers, right, is kind of confidence with uncertainty as a key part of how they make decisions. And that sounds like something that's very easy to say, but what do I mean? I think in many organizations, you rise to the position of leadership by being good, right, and confident, and making decisions, and sometimes knowing more than the folks below you in the organization. I actually don't think that's certainly not my belief. I think that you rise based on your ability to make decisions across the breadth of what's known and unknown. So I think the biggest thing is really about managing uncertainty in decision making instead of having to know all the answers. So I think having to know all the answers tends to lead to this kind of either paralysis or to doing the same thing you did before, or to the position where you kind of forget that you can't possibly know everything that you need to know in order to make a decision. And therefore, yesterday, with Colin Powell dying, this very interesting thing he always used to say about was his 40-70 rule. That you can never have enough information to make a decision. And there's a certain point, below which you can't make a decision, but also that sometimes you're wasting time trying to collect too much information with which to make a decision. And I think that rule, is very pertinent for a leader as honest and transparent as he was, and I think as many of the folks that I talk to.
So, Mike, I just want to repeat what I heard you say a minute ago, because it's, in my mind, it was a little disorienting because it's so different. What I think I heard you say is to enter into uncertainty without this high level of confidence, not incompetence, not to go to the level of incompetence, but back off on the confidence and go in with not having the sense that you need to have all the answers. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so, because there's two poles, there's two ends of the spectrum. One is that you do believe that you have enough knowledge across all of the domains that you need to have the knowledge across in order then to be able to make a good decision. Or you can go to the other end and say, well, actually, because no one knows anything, we need to find a way to get through this. And unfortunately, like real life, or certainly decisions about the future, are more like the second than the first, right? Which is, I often use this metaphor of, kind of dark street with one street light. And most people stand under the light of that street light, and everything is really based on what's known within that light. But you do know that there are other parts of the street to explore, and setting off with flashlights, or deploying your team differently. And we've got this motto we have internally, which is, without a plan, 10 can see no further than one. So you have this kind of, this belief that, the furthest out we can see is based on the eyesight of the best of us. You go, well, that's not really the way the world works. In order to use 10 people actively, you need to position them right. You need to say, well, how do the strengths and weaknesses work in that space, and then accept that some things are knowable, some things are unknowable until you do the work. But actually managing the uncertainty within the decision, so, well, let's at least address these knowns and unknowns, and begin to work in that world instead of the other. So I think leaders who respect the domain expertise of their teams don't need to be the people in charge of the decision. They need to be the person in charge of, have we taken the steps to manage the uncertainty, to address opportunity as well as risk. And I think that word for me is one of the key, defining ideas, which is this is really opportunity seeking behavior. If you're a leader looking for opportunity, you could be defined by what you know, or which probably is defined by where you've been. But knowing where you're going to go to is really about understanding, something that, by definition, no one knows, but you need to find a way through that. And I think that the nicer part of the spectrum for me is really this one where we accept uncertainty, accept complexity, and begin to address it as an active process. But of course, leaders need to be confident, to be challenged, to be open, to be transparent in, how they're making decisions. That's the other thing, is this kind of confident assertion that I've made a decision and I'm right, I'm going to do this thing. Well, that's fine if people believe in the process that got you there. And I think then there's trust and other things can emerge. But I think the humility to accept that other people might know more than you do, is also going to be about listening and addressing that key uncertainty.
Yeah, and you just said the word that was bubbling to the surface for me is at the core of this is humility. And the fruit of humility is listening, not needing to have all the answers. And humility really is a matter of the heart. And I'm always fascinated in the on-ramp to humility, because that's not how we show up typically to the world. The world has programmed us in so many ways to not be humble.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, as you are mentoring team members or other leaders, or even your own journey, what was the on-ramp to that level of humility?
No, it's interesting because I've had this discussion with a coach recently about strengths, weaknesses, and so forth. And I think I've been lucky in some ways that I didn't over-index as an academic, and I didn't over-index as any one thing. So, lucky also not to go to medical school or a bunch of other places where I think they do teach you to be confident in the decision that you just took, and to need to know yourself enough to make a decision, because you're the one on the stoop for the decision, which is fine, I think. But confidence in your team isn't the same as confidence in yourself. And which I think then introduces this idea of vulnerability and humility, which is maybe some people know more than I do, which I think, it sounds silly to say that out loud, but that's not the way that, as you say, people are trained, right? Which is you get to leadership positions often by being the best in your discipline, by therefore asserting opinions confidently, and so forth. And these are often about facts or about knowledge. But I think it's different if you've got a view on what's philosophically interesting or what's scientifically interesting. I think showing up as someone who's curious often is different than showing up as someone that knows. And I've been lucky, I've always been curious in many different environments, and the people I admire the most are, go back to people like Stephen Jay Gould or others who can bring together this enormous range of interesting subjects into a hypothesis or an idea. And I think humility, intellectual humility is one thing. I think the ability to confidently get that across, I think, is also important. But being right isn't, I think, the defining characteristic. I think someone who's right constantly can only ever be right in this very small window of things. I think being right across a complex decision is going to be hard, and doing that serially can't be about you. It has to be about the people who you have around you. And even people like Steve Jobs, I'm going to say Steve Jobs Mark II, the kind of Steve Jobs that came back to Apple instead of the Steve Jobs that left, he was always at pains to point out the value of the organization rather than his own views as a kind of key organizing principle for how you got the best out of good ideas.
Yeah, and the path to humility, it can come from different ways. pain, suffering can lead to humility. Choice. So some people, through coaching, mentoring, modeling leaders, they choose that path. What was your path to the decision to take the humble approach?
Well, as I say, I think it'd be hard for me to do the opposite. I mean, to confidently assert that I know the answers. I'm not a detailed person, so when it comes to the textbooks and so forth, I read a lot of books, but I must admit that I read them quickly and get the idea out of them, the concept out of them, way more than I could remember line 3 on page 25. Which some people are really good at. That tells you something about the way that you work in a team. Which is, some people can do that, but if you've read breadth, if you've read range, then those people, I think, also have value to you. And then maybe team sports do it to you too. You look at the kind of philosophy of team sports and how important any individual is to a team. And I remember some great research on the importance of a great player in a basketball team versus a great player on a soccer team. So within a basketball team, it's often defined by its best player. In a soccer team, it's defined by its worst player. There's the strength of that team. And I always thought that was such an interesting difference just in the numbers, right? Which is, your weakest. But then you need to organize. You need to organize with that, against that. So maybe it's sports, maybe it's just inability to be as smart as some other folks. But certainly, I found that it changes how you listen. It changes how you approach maybe a what if question. Because some people are overconfident or under, too anxious really to ask, that's interesting. Can you just help me understand this a little bit more? Bring curiosity to a question. You often find really smart people nodding along to stuff. Just yeah. Oh no, that doesn't make sense. But having the curiosity to say, tell me more. I think that's been a natural part of who I've been, and I think it's been helpful in the way that we've organized the kind of work that we do as well.
Yeah, so clearly humility is a core value of yours. It's right. It's on the top. It's on the, maybe if it's not the top one, it's in that top 3 or 5. How have you created a culture in your organization around humility, around the fruit of humility, asking the question, listening, not needing to know the answer? How have you created that as part of the organization's culture, not just your own personal value?
Yeah, so it's, I think, reflection of the same thing, which is you can't have layers and silos and divisions. People can have good ideas wherever they come from, and I think as soon as you stop listening, then you stop succeeding. So we've created a very flat culture, but one in which anyone can ask questions outside of their domain of expertise. They can ask it of anyone. Some of what we've done has been, I'm going to say, cultural in that sense of purposefully humorous. I think humans use humor as well as humility to get by in groups. Saying things that are maybe not wholly stupid questions, but they are a little bit, maybe someone that really knows their stuff might think it's a stupid question. Being okay with that, and having the person also on the other side of that question feel it's okay to explain or have to explain it. And what we found over time is that sometimes the people that think they know, when challenged, are also interested in going further on the, they just hadn't thought of it a certain way. I've got physicians at work who, sometimes when you ask them a question about, how many kidneys do you have? Those kinds of things that, they look at you with this kind of puzzlement of, do you genuinely not know? Or is it is this one of those questions where you do know, but you want me to go deeper? And I think that kind of, lack of pretension, the ability to challenge has been part of this. But also, one of the key things as a consulting group was to say, well, we don't want to be a consultancy. We don't want to keep giving clients the right answer, because that would be a remarkably arrogant thing for us to do. It's like, in some way we're smarter, or we do something differently. But actually we said, look, we're going to bring you possibilities. We're going to bring you ideas that maybe you hadn't thought of. No dishonor in that, but we've got breadth, we've got range to bring to the table. So again, we need to produce that culture within a client relationship as well, which is we're going to show you some things that maybe you hadn't thought of, or we're going to give you some ideas that you had thought of, but maybe some consequences that you hadn't. Those kinds of things. So it changes the nature of the dialogue from being who's right conversation into who's the most interesting, who brought me something that I hadn't thought of before. And that's a really nice environment to kind of grow up in as an organization and to deal with. But it means that people are going to bring their best selves, their curiosity to the table as well. And equally, as soon as someone becomes overconfident in any assertion, the group itself will be quick to challenge that.
The word that's coming up, Mike, is what you've created is a really authentic culture. And what I mean by that is you are who you are.
Yeah.
Like it or leave it. This is who I am. These are my values. You've created a culture within the walls of your organization that mirrors that. And it takes on its own shape and form. And then it then extends to how you serve your clients and the type of clients, because I could imagine the client who wants the right answer is probably not the client for you. They also need to be part of this mix, this cultural mix of being okay with you guys not knowing, but presenting them with possibilities. So I really get this. What you've created is a culture that's really authentic.
Well, I think it's critical, right? Which is, if you look across different industries, I mean, one of my favorite books, Ed Catmull's book, Creativity Inc., the guy that started Pixar, he talks about that authentic culture, but also it is important that people bring, not just their skill and discipline within their domain, but maybe their lived experience, beyond that. And the people I tend to like the most are the people who will bring in, music reference, or they're bringing a film reference, or they're bringing a book that they were reading on wood or on sand, and they go, what was really interesting here was this. And sometimes, a lot of what we do as humans is based on metaphor, it's based on analogy, it's based on people's ability to communicate. And I think the broader those folks are, the easier it is. But also you gotta feel comfortable to deliver an opinion or a what if, and not be judged for it, because our big thing is, if you're going to manage uncertainty, you need to produce a plan to learn. And a lot of the books on innovation will say, look, innovation tends to happen obliquely. It tends to pivot, tends to be serendipitous. So, but the definition of serendipity is this really interesting one, which is not just luck, it's not just good or bad luck. It's when it happened to you, were you ready? And could you see the opportunity in what was just presented? So then you need people that aren't just linear thinkers. You need people that can, that can go broad in that as well. And it could be someone brings interesting vocabulary to the table, or if someone brings an interesting example of what they've seen somewhere else, or even outside of our industry. So the second you try and beat that out of people, I think is when it starts to fail. But and also on a Monday morning, it's a lot more fun turning up to a group of people like that than the people that just are great at the spreadsheets or great at the science.
Yeah, this image I get is this core operating system that you've created is the engine, is these core values. And then what I also hear you saying is honoring the individuals who come your way, and get to plug into that operating system, bringing their own uniqueness, their love for music, their love for agriculture or gardening or whatever it is, beer, and bringing that into to plug into this core operating system.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because as you dig a couple of layers into someone. If it's beer, how interested are they? Is it just consuming it on a Friday night, or are they interested in microbreweries and the process and history or whatever? And it's a bit like in order to be a great artist, you look at someone like Leonardo da Vinci had to be interested in a bunch of other things other than just being able to draw, the idea of physics or anatomy or, all those things. You got to bring those strands together. This kind of synthesis happens. And I think the same thing happens with teams. There is a synthesis of, its component parts. If it's allowed to be, we once asked this question, we still don't know the answer to this, but I think it's an interesting question, which is, could you measure the IQ of a team? Because often teams seem either smarter or not as smart as the individuals within them. And I think a lot of our process in industry in general tends to take really smart people and then make them do, things that none of them would do if they were allowed. So I think inverting that and saying, well, how do we make a team better than the individuals in it? That's a really interesting, then you get into, music and a bunch of other kind of interesting areas as well. It's, how you produce something that none of the individuals in the team could have done themselves.
Yeah, that's actually where my head was going. Is you're a music lover, player of music, producing of music, supporting music, and it just feels like that part of you has had a huge influence on how you view tackling a problem, creating an organization. What have you, if you could just call out maybe some of those specific lessons out of your love and your involvement in music that have influenced you in a significant way as a leader?
Yeah, well, again, I go back to the thing about being lucky or unlucky. So I'm really not a musician, right? So I live vicariously through a bunch of musicians. So I know I don't have that talent, but I do have the passion. And there's a really interesting thing, which is, what's your role as a musician? Is it to, if you're a solo musician, it's one thing, is the self-improvement, the selection of material, but the music I tend to like tends to be, indie rock, in general. And then you look at the way the bands form and the way that musicians collaborate, and if I go back a few years, I had a syndicated column in the UK, an album review column, and in addition to that, I was asked to do this kind of special column for one paper, which was the golden years of musicians. And it was remarkable how many artists had 2-3 album runs. It didn't matter who you were, Frank Sinatra, Elvis, everyone had this kind of really interesting golden period, typically 1 or 2 albums in when their best work was produced. And there was this interesting thing about, bringing that history, bringing that authenticity, figuring out a way to work together in order to produce great music and being collaborative. And, in many cases, even the stories of, strong founder-led organizations often weren't. So I think I wrote a piece about the Beatles and how important George Martin was, not just to how, they made music or recorded it, but to actually the creation. So he would bring in technologies that would enable them to make the music that they did. The importance of competition. You look at, at the same time we had the Rolling Stones and the Beach Boys all driving each other on, this kind of real passion to do that. And then even, so my record label isn't anything to talk about really, but many bands that we think of as iconic, people laugh at record labels turning down the Beatles, but the Beatles, when they were presenting themselves to be signed, were a covers band. I mean, that's all they were. They were a guitar band from Liverpool that could only play covers at this point. They went to Hamburg and came back as an actual band. So signing them, and even their first album was mostly covers, right? Same thing with Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's first album is all covers. So we think about this great creative genius, but he wasn't a great creative genius on day one. He was allowed to become one. He was allowed to experiment, allowed to explore. And I kind of love that bit of, finding your path as opposed to somebody else's path, not fitting into a predetermined mold, but also having someone back, essentially patronize your journey to allow you to do that. So, some of my favorite artists would be, Tom Waits, who just goes his own direction, or Radiohead. And the stories from like Radiohead, as soon as they become famous and successful, their next record, they go in and they don't play their own instruments. They purposefully, set up with, you give Tom York the bass and you give Johnny Greenwood, the drums, and you see what happens. And I kind of like that spirit. I like that energy. that enthusiasm, the desire to challenge yourselves as well. So I think there's so many lessons from music and musicians, that I think are appropriate for how group dynamics work well and don't work well. But you also see the decline in bands when someone decides that they're the one bringing it. They're the John Lennon, and really they should be off to making a solo career out of this. And often then you get this interesting decline. But I'd bring that all the way back to this leadership question as well. As if you're not prepared to listen to your bandmates tell you that the lyrics suck, or how about we go faster or slower here. I used to love this idea. I mean, George Martin and I think a couple of other producers have always done this thing, which is to take a core song concept and say, right, I'd like you to play it at 50% speed. I'd like you to play it twice as fast. I'd like you to play a country version of it, and I want you to kind of keep playing with it. And now I want you to come back and tell me whether that version was the version that you want to record, because you'll have learned something by the play. You'll have learned something by the way it works, and that used to work in concerts as well. You look at Bruce Springsteen, typically refining songs for 10 years before they get recorded. And they change and pivot, and that process I think is a really important part of how I think you bring the world into your ideas as well. Is just to say, well, because I couldn't have written it down on day one as a perfect thing. I'm going to need someone to interact with me to tell me. That might be an audience, it might be my bandmates, it might be a producer, might be actually launching it and then having to re-record it. So I find it such a fascinating set of things, from skills to collaboration to the impact of others on your work.
Yeah, the word that's coming up for me, and there's probably a lot of elements that made those great creatives possible, but the word is safe. It was a safe environment for them to experiment, to explore, to create, to grow in a world where it's produced, microwave culture, instant results, produce now. What I think is lost in so many teams or bands, even we could go to that, is it's not safe. Well, I have to know the answer. I have to produce, otherwise I'm on the line. And it just feels like that's a quality of the environment that you've embraced in your leadership.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important idea, and safety. Probably with bravery, I mean, safety to be brave as well. I think that, the desire to disrupt, the desire to pursue. And I always draw interesting parallels between, say, the way that Google, was maybe 10 years ago when it created Google X, its incubator group. And I remember talking to someone there about, I'd always had this interesting idea about the 20% time. I had heard a lot about it, but never really met anyone that had been through it. And I met someone at a conference, and they said, yeah, we get 20% time. Typically, we're allowed on Saturdays to work on our own things, but it's true. He said, I'm here today because of that. And I said, okay, tell me more about that. And he said, okay, I came up with an idea, and it got funded, and we got started. And I said, well, just help me, because in our industry, that'd be quite a long process. So no, it was about 2 weeks. I said, okay, interesting. 2 weeks and about $20 million. And I said, okay, that's really interesting. So how many yeses did it take? And he said, 2, my manager and Sergey. Those were the 2 yeses. And well, what an interesting contrast to the way that it often happens. And I go, well, for that to happen, there needs to be some confidence or some pre-specification that you're interested in something that you don't know. Someone could have an idea that could disrupt things. I was always fascinated by that. And I chased down, did an interview with this guy who worked at Google X, and said, there's about 300 people internally all set up to disrupt. They form teams, they go, they build things, but there's some defining principles, one of which is the idea has to be something that would disrupt Google. So and so the reason that we have 300 is because we don't know which ideas are going to work, which ones aren't. Again, this confidently uncertain with which of the ideas are great ideas. The only way to do it is to find out. We need a lot of them, because again, that's the way this works. So there is a safety, which is, you are employed, but at the same time, there is a kind of bravery as well, which is we want to find ways to disrupt ourselves, because if we don't do this, someone else might. But so I kind of like that humility, which is, even if you're Sergey Brin, that there must be someone, some part of you that says, well, I don't know the answer. So if someone brings me something, I'm going to quickly say yes, because I could spend my time trying to figure out if it's a good idea or not, but I don't know how to do that. Even though I'm, one of the world's great geniuses, I would rather just set you off with some investment and let you go find out. So I think you're right. Safety, fallback, but also I think supportive, supporting your bravery on the way forwards.
Mm. Mm. So if we bring it back to, because we're just talking about all of this is the culture, the environment that you create for the magic to happen, for the work to get done. And so just the title of our series, Conversations that Leaders Aren't Having. What would you say, with all of this being said, what is the conversation you would invite CEOs and leaders to start having, given everything we've talked about for the last 20 minutes?
There's a big one in our industry at the moment about, diversity, inclusion, exclusion, whether we have an industry with purpose. And I do think this all links to that question about, confidence, certainty, knowing what the world wants, knowing what it doesn't. Essentially, most of our companies are doing the same thing. But if I focus, for example, on this inclusion stuff, so often we measure, do we have representative populations in our studies? So we set up a bunch of clinical studies. We measure, if we got gender diversity, if we got racial inclusion, and it's easy to track those numbers, right? And often we fail even at those numbers. My biggest concern is that's nice, because that's the stuff that's under the street light, right? Those are the studies we are doing. What about the studies we didn't do? What about the stuff that we chose not to even begin to focus on, where we're not counting any of those inclusion, exclusion sort of numbers? So I think we have a model within our industry, and I think this is true in other industries, which is based on your ability to predict what a market wants, predict how easy it's going to be, predict what price you'll be able to sell this at. I think if you abandon that idea that or can predict, which follows from knowing, and say, well, we need to find out, we need to have a way of saying, look, what's a great way to do this. Sometimes the world comes towards us and we have to do that, like we did with COVID, and then we saw a great response. Suddenly no one knew anything about that other than they could go back to technologies, and someone knew if they could go looking for this. But again, you've got the Beatles type things. The vaccine that AstraZeneca developed they weren't the first people they went to. They were just the first people to say yes. So a bit like, the people that signed the Beatles. And so I think this conversation about, who we're for, who we want our customers to be. I think this is an industry that could pivot, could be more, focused on meeting the real needs of real people, not just the next high-priced medicine through. If we embrace the model, for example, where all of our products were $30, like the vaccines are, or we started to look for prevention instead of treatments, those kinds of things are interesting conversations that do challenge, mindset, philosophy, and so forth. So, I think a lot of this, comes back down to, let's think about the world as the 8 billion people that it will be, rather than the 300 million that sit within the US, and or even possibly the 50 million that sit within the US that can really afford the medicines that we're developing, and maybe approach that differently and be different than we've been before.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end of our time, and the question that I love to always ask CEOs is the conversation that you would have with your pre-CEO self, given the road that you've traveled over these years. what would, and you're a man of the question, so I'm actually not going to ask you what advice you would give the young Mike. What's the question or questions that you would ask Mike, your younger self, to get him thinking and prepared for what was to come?
I don't know, it might sound boring, but I if I was to loop back to, I've had a long journey to kind of accepting, I'm going to say, what felt like weaknesses, and not just see them as strengths, right? So not just pivot to these being strengths, but actually find a way that they are strengths, right? So this, especially as you're young, right? They try and elevate the flats, right? So they go, right, you got these peaks and you got all these things that are flats, but so you got to work on those. You got to work on these weaknesses, and that never sat too well with me, because some things are just hard, right? And sometimes they are who you are, and some things are not who you're not. I think finding a place where that has real value, I think, is really important. So I think often it was about fitting, the profile, being better at the things that you're good at, worrying less about the things that you're not. Because the great thing is, teams can fill in for the things that you're not, as long as you make it possible to do it that way. So I think I probably spent a long time thinking about my perception of other CEOs or other leaders of businesses or whatever as perfect. When I look at other CEOs, I'm always amazed at their tenacity, their confidence, their command of their subject, their tirelessness. And somebody said, well, yeah, but you don't see them 24 hours a day. You just see the highlights. But also, you don't have to be that person. You could be you as a leader of your business, and have that be meaningful. And so in my case, this was about quickly finding the people that I could have as part of the team. So I think that would probably be the thing that would accelerate me getting to where I am, or being happier 5-10 years ago than I was in sort of working on my weaknesses. But say, as soon as you stop seeing that as this incredible strength that you're missing, you start saying, well, actually, I'm going to get my strength from having people around me, not just to fill in, but to be at least as active in leading in their own way with my help as possible. So that would probably be my quick answer. That wasn't very quick. No,
it was great. And I just, for leaders at any level, I think what I'm taking away from myself, that I'm sure will show up in conversations that I'm having with clients, is get comfortable in your own skin. And maybe the question is, what's your own skin? Getting clear, what is your own skin? And getting clear on that, and then finding a place where you in your own skin can add value to a situation, to a team, to an organization. Yeah, I love that question. That's percolating for me. What is your skin?
Yes. Yeah.
Not somebody else's skin.
And work
What's
on
your
it.
skin?
Yeah. I'd say it's. I think this idea you should work on your weaknesses. I actually think working on strengths is it's a really important thing. It's be stronger at the thing that you're good at, whether that's language or creativity. I think the more you work at it, the better you'll be at your strengths, and I think that's when you become really valuable to somebody. So just being an all-rounder is one thing. Certainly, that's what I found, is that the more I lent into thinking about creativity as an active process instead of a slightly magical one. I think the better the process becomes, it's easier then to help people to work with you and so forth. So yeah.
Well, I could imagine we could probably talk for another couple hours on any number of these points and others. So we'll have to book that time for a part 2. But in the meantime, as people wait for that part 2 of our conversation, whenever that might be, for those that are interested, Mike, where can they find out more about you or to connect with you?
So if you search online, I think there are 2 or 3 Mike Rears that. So there's the bodybuilder guy, there's a kind of environmental guy, and then there's me. But if you search at IDEA Pharma on most of the socials. The company Twitter is managed by me, so you get typically random thoughts. As you say, there's a bunch of cartoons and other things that tend to swirl around too. So some of this is stream of consciousness stuff. But yeah, at IDEA Pharma is the easiest way to find me online. Awesome. And don't worry about the pics in the swimming trunks. That's not me.
Well, we'll put in the different posts that we have. We'll put some of that. We'll put that information there, and in the description of the full conversation. Mike, it's really a pleasure, a lot of fun, and really even more of a fan now of what you're up to and how you approach the world. So thanks so much for sharing all your wisdom.
Thank you, Jeff. No, I really appreciate the invitation and for your your great ability to question and dive in. Thank you.
Yeah. It's my pleasure.